So now we have lighted the second candle in the Advent season. Now, according to the dictionary, Advent means the arrival of a notable person, thing, or event. In Western culture, Advent means the first season in the Christian church year, leading up to Christmas. In Christian theology, it means the coming or second coming of Christ. At Unity, we concentrate on the birth of Christ within. We use this season to reboot ourselves, if you will, for the coming year by acknowledging our Christ consciousness within, this state of consciousness that brings about peace and goodwill toward others. Living this way, for us, manifests health, harmony, love, and abundance. We call that very often heaven on earth. You know, we all know it's very easy to get caught up with the frenzy of the more material and commercial aspects of Christmas, but the best gift that we can give ourselves and to others is to live in this Christ consciousness state, to be kind, compassionate, forgiving, and loving toward all beings in the world. To kickstart that a little, I'd like to talk about how exactly we can do this, allow our Christ consciousness to reign in our lives. One way is to listen to our inner prophet. This inner prophet is our divine inner voice. You are divine. We know that at Unity. All of us are divine. Everyone in the world is divine. And you only need to listen to that inner voice to access that spirit within you. It's there. It's your spiritual wisdom. This inner prophet is trying to tell you how to live. All true religions have this concept of the Christ or Krishna or Christus consciousness. But in the Christian, Judaic, Muslim biblical teachings, the three religions that are based on the Bible, the prophets all prophesied Christ's coming. In the Christian teachings, they consider the man Jesus to be that Christ. In Unity, we don't worship the man Jesus. We don't believe Jesus wanted us to just worship him. We believe, as Jesus said, that all of us can become or realize that we are the Christ. We believe that Jesus actually did that. The man became the Christ. Thus, he serves as a model to us. But he clearly said, and we repeat often here, these things that I do, ye shall do also and greater. And that includes becoming the Christ. In the Bible, prophets predicted the coming of Christ, the birth of Christ. At Unity, we look at that metaphysically to mean that we have inner prophets that tell us that it is possible to give birth to our Christ, our inner higher self. It's that intuition or that instinct that we have in us that just knows that we can evolve into our true selves and become more than the mundane, earthbound beings that we often get programmed into accepting. And these higher selves, like the Magi in the Bible, offer us the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, or love, peace, and purity, understanding, hope, and abundance. They are indeed great gifts if we live in our Christ selves. We don't have to look for these things outside of ourselves anymore, because we are filled to the brim with them inside. We become aware of them, is what happens. It's interesting because of all the biblical characters that we can study, the most important group, the most interesting anyway, are the prophets. So what exactly was their function, and what function do our inner prophets have in our development? These prophets served as a vital function in the history of Israel, and it behooves us to become aware of their function within us. In Unity, we look at the Bible in a number of different ways. We look at it as history, as poetry, as wisdom literature, in many ways. And one of the ways we look at it that's very important is in the metaphysical terms. This means that we look at the whole Bible as being symbolic of something within us. We look at each character in the Bible as if that story were actually taking place within us right now, as if that character is a part of us. If you've ever worked with dreams, and I'm looking out here, I know a number of you have, one of the first things that you learn is that everything in the dream represents a part of you. For example, if you have a dream about a plane crash, the psychiatrist may ask you how you feel being each of those parts of the crashed plane. How do you feel being the twisted, useless fuselage? How do you feel about being the burned tire? What is your reaction to being the ruined radio, no longer able to communicate, or the damaged seat, which cannot offer comfort anymore? Or the child who survived but is terrified because it's alone without the security of his parents. And so it is with the Bible. Every story in the Bible is a part of the reader, just as everything in your dreams, or everything is really a mirror of you. That's one reason, perhaps, the primary reason really, that we study the Bible at Unity. It is a mirror of our very soul. We can see parts of ourselves in each character, in each place, and thus we see spiritual principles at work. These are all mirrors of what is unconsciously troubling us, so it's helpful to notice our dreams and let them tell us what's troubling us so that we can know how to deal with it. And it is also very helpful in the same way to do the same with Bible stories. For example, when Jesus brings Lazarus back to life by seeing him whole, it illustrates that when we are in our Christ consciousness, we too can bring to life parts of us that have been dead, like our hopes and our dreams. When Moses or Jesus ascend a mountain and then return with the great teachings, it metaphysically represents our inner Moses or Christ ascending to a higher plane of consciousness and thereby attaining wisdom to live by and then come back and share, as Moses did with the Ten Commandments. Now today, we are going to look at our inner prophet. To do this, we first need to look at the prophets in the Bible. The biblical prophets served a very vital function in the history of Israel. The word prophet comes from the Greek word prophetes, and it means to speak for someone else, specifically to speak for God. So the function of the prophet was to speak for God. The prophets were God's spokesman. Now, if we look very quickly at the history of Israel, we can see why and how the function of the prophets evolved. Way back in the beginning, with Abraham, we see that God spoke to Abraham directly. God spoke to Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, and Samuel directly. Now, at one point in Hebrew history, the political leaders were also the spiritual leaders. So God spoke directly to the leaders of the nation. But there came a point in Israel's history when political leaders became specialized and kings were elected. Then the nation's leaders were just political leaders. They were no longer the spiritual leaders also. So the kings were no longer able to receive this direct communication from God. At this point, the prophet's function evolved. It became necessary for someone to speak the word of God. And since the kings were no longer able to hear the word of God directly, The prophets developed that as their primary function. This all has a very interesting metaphysical parallel in our own lives, of course. Our inner king represents our human will, our ego. Thus, our king, our will, is the king, if you will, of our consciousness. Our will is what usually determines what we do in life, our ego. But that human will is not capable of receiving divine guidance directly. That's not the function of our ego. So there's a part of ourselves that must arise to fulfill that function. Thus, we have the prophet within, that part of us that is capable of receiving the direct communication from Spirit. The prophet within serves the same function as the biblical prophets of old. It is the part of us that is capable of hearing God's voice, that higher voice in our awareness, which shows us what God's will is for us. Now, the Old Testament prophet spoke for God and had an even more specific function, that of pointing out the errors of the children of Israel. They pointed out the ways in which they had gone astray from the covenant that they themselves had made when they became the chosen people. Chosen people means those of us who have chosen to be God's people. The prophet would say specifically how that covenant had been violated. The prophets, you might say, were the divine gadflies. The prophet's function was to get Israel back on track, back on the path. The prophet within us does exactly the same thing. It gets us back on our spiritual path so that we put higher wisdom and higher values above worldly values. For example, the prophet Isaiah says, "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged." I love that. Reminds me of all the fundamentalist preachers I grew up with in Shreveport. So the prophet Isaiah is telling the people in no uncertain terms that they are not doing what God wants them to do. He's trying to get their attention. One of the primary errors was the one of hypocrisy. Israel, like many nations of today, had fallen in the trap of substituting a ritual for true worship. They were substituting style for substance and meaning. They had gotten caught up with the outer form of worship and just looking like good people. They had lost sight of true devotion and true morality. Again, it says in Isaiah, "Wash yourselves and make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doings. Cease doing evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice and correct oppression." Isaiah is simply saying, do good, follow the law, and then come back and pray. The prophets would often warn of dire consequences, doom and gloom prophecies. Jeremiah says in chapter 4, "I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void. The mountains quaked, the hills moved to and fro. All the birds had fled, the fruitful land was a desert, and cities were laid in ruin before the Lord, before his fierce anger." Sounds like a very ominous warning, doesn't it? These are ideas which fire and brimstone preachers, of course, have a heyday with. But the reality is that these prophets always show that these ominous events were the result of man's choices. It was not the will of a capricious or vengeful God that was bringing suffering upon people. Absolutely not. This was simply the law of cause and effect, karma, if you will. One of the reasons for forecasting doom and gloom was not to scare people, but to warn them to wake up for their own good, so they wouldn't create suffering and misery in their own lives. Jeremiah says, "Your ways and your doing have brought this upon you. This is your doom, and it is bitter. It has reached your very heart." He's telling the children of Israel, you have created this. Don't blame God. You've brought this upon yourself. You do certain things and there'll be bad results, in other words. Kill your neighbor and you'll probably go to jail. That's not very pleasant. Slander your neighbor and you'll be sued for slander. Be unforgiving and your unconscious will register that humans are unforgivable, and you will suffer from guilt and unworthiness yourself. You speed on Nashville and Canal Boulevard and you get one of those $110 camera tickets, and you won't be able to buy that new outfit you want. I know a lot about that. If you don't do your homework, you might not graduate and get the job you want. Karma. And the prophets always pointed out that we have a choice. They pointed out the consequences of the choices that we make. But they were very, very positive too. They told us what good and fulfilling lives we would live if we observed the eternal laws and wisdom. The point is that it was not a vengeful God that threatened the people. There were prophets who spoke for God and tried to wake people up. But it was so that they could see the light and not create unhappiness for themselves and others. This is the time of year to make special efforts to listen to our inner prophets who announce the coming of Christ in us. That part of us that sees and lives on a higher level. A level which creates heaven on earth for us and everyone around us. And remember that the prophets were not popular. They were often not listened to because almost always what they had to say was 180 degrees opposite from public opinion and prevailing thought. That tells us a great deal about our inner prophets, and is my reason for sharing all of these biblical quotes with you. The function of the biblical prophets mirrors very closely the function of our inner prophet. The biblical prophets were spokesmen for God. They conveyed God's will and God's guidance. Their purpose was to bring awareness of error, to point out the hidden errors of society. And even more importantly, their purpose was to initiate change, to get Israel or Judah back on track. Our inner prophet has exactly the same function, to serve as a divine guidance, to point out to us our hidden errors, to point out to us ways in which we have gotten off the path that we chose, ways we have perhaps become unaware of, or ways we have denied, maybe parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at, but that if we don't look at can cause us a lot of trouble. Our inner prophet, if listened to, can point out these errors and give us motivation and incentive to correct them and get us back on track so that we can realign ourselves with our inner Christ, thus allowing this Christ to be reborn in us. Our inner prophet shows us our blind spots, our hypocrisies, our denials. And like in the Old Testament, the prophet within us is often ignored and always to our detriment. Have you ever had the experience of going to do something and a little voice in you says, don't do it, and you don't listen, and bam, we do it? Most of the time we later say, gee, I wish I'd listened to that little inner voice. Has that ever happened to anybody in here? The prophet in us tells us things we don't want to hear. For example, if we're angry at someone, our inner prophet might say, look at yourself. You are causing your own anger. How many people like to hear that? Not me. We want to believe that it's somebody else's fault. It's like the text one of our members sent me this week. It said, don't blame a clown for acting like a clown. Ask yourself why you keep going to circuses. Thank you, Shay. And so often we don't listen to that inner prophet because it's something we don't want to hear. Our ego, our inner king of Israel, has created a barrier, and that barrier keeps us from hearing God's voice within us. Consequently, the prophet speaks to us in a variety of ways because we're not always capable of hearing God's voice. Sometimes we don't let ourselves become capable of hearing God's voice. So how does this inner prophet work then? One way to get our attention is through the events of our lives, especially those events that are dramatic and memorable. Have you ever had something happen to you where you felt like you'd just been hit over the head with a baseball bat? Very often these events are serious illness, accident, divorce, death of a loved one, maybe a financial misfortune. Now, God does not cause those things to happen to us. God does not punish, ever. But the point is that sometimes it's only when those things happen that we stop and listen to our inner prophet and really look at our lives and reevaluate what is important. Maybe we even see how we've caused some of those events. There we are again, sitting in the circus, feeling negative about that clown behaving stupidly. Again, we shouldn't wait for such an event to wake up, because we will miss out on lots and lots of time that we could be living the kind of lives that bring us joy. We may experience mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual pain by that point. That pain, of course, gets our attention and can wake us up. The suffering can maybe help us reevaluate and change our beliefs. But if we can do that earlier, if we can wake up earlier, we will avoid a lot of suffering. Another way our inner prophet speaks to us is through other people, in the guise of friends, relatives, or even enemies. If they say something that makes us angry or defensive, there is a prophet at work. We might want to say, he really makes me angry. It's his fault that I'm angry. However, most of the time, when we feel angry or defensive, it's because our ego is threatened. There is some part of us maybe that fears getting hurt. Rather than dump blame on the other person, which does us no good in the long run, the wiser thing would be to use that opportunity to look at ourselves and say, what barrier have I created here? What have I done to separate myself from that other person? Anger often results when someone touches parts of us that we don't want to see. We may later realize that there is a tender spot in us, where a place where our buttons can be pushed. If we face the fact that it's we who have the problem, that is, our ego or old wound was triggered, then we can cure the problem and never suffer again from that situation. If we blame our misery on the other person, we'll have to continue dealing with our emotional upheaval every time someone triggers that old wound or ego. So during this Christmas season, be aware of your inner prophet who is announcing the coming of Christ, the possibility of your awareness of your Christ consciousness, which allows you to live the wonderful life that all spiritual teachings promise. Don't let your inner King Herod or ego reject the Christ in you and decree to destroy it, like King Herod did in the Bible. Don't listen to worldly thoughts like that. Listen to your prophet and be prepared to give birth to this Christ in you. Your life will improve vastly if you do, and you'll be taking one more step toward creating the heaven on earth that is possible in your life, and the resultant peace, joy, and love, the gifts of abundance, health, and security, and life that you all deserve. Amen.